11. "Rick!" exclaimed Amanda Pirelli, surprised. "What are you doing home? I thought you were helping your dad set up the carnival." We were, Mum, but something came up." She frowned. "What sort of something?" "It's complicated," he said. "I've brought someone home with me. Is that okay?" Her frown deepened. "What do you mean, someone? What's going on, Rick?" "Maybe it'd be better if she explained," Rick said. "She? What do you—" "Oh." Martha had been hovering outside the kitchen door, but she took Rick's fumbled introduction as a cue to make her entrance. As soon as she stepped into the room, she saw the expression on Rick's mum's face change from bewilderment to alarm, and knew instantly what she was thinking. "Hiya, Mrs. Pirelli," she said. "My name's Martha Jones. There's nothing to worry about. Rick's just been helping us out, that's all." "Us?" said Amanda, looking from Martha to Rick and then back again. "What the hell is going on?" "Like I said, Mum, it's complicated," said Rick miserably. "Are you in trouble?" she asked. "You could say that, yeah." Her expression hardened. "Well, maybe you'd better tell me about it." "You'd never believe us." "Try me." Rick looked desperately at Martha. She said, "I think maybe you'd better sit down first, Mrs. Pirelli." Amanda glared at her. "I will not sit down. This is my house. Now will someone please tell me what is going on, or shall I call the police?" Martha sighed and held up the necklace. "It started when Rick and his friends dug this up," she said. "Dug it up? What do you mean, dug it up? Dug it up from where?" "From under the tree, Ma'am," said Rick. "The black tree at the bottom of the garden. Only it's not really a tree, it's—" "Let's not jump the gun," said Martha hastily. She nodded warily at the dining table in the centre of the kitchen floor. "Do you mind if I sit down?" Amanda pursed her lips, and Martha was sure she was about to say, "I'd rather you leave." But then she gave a brief nod, and Martha sank gratefully onto a wooden dining chair. Haltingly, hesitantly, Martha and Rick told Amanda about the book, the tree, the mist, the Hoboken. It was not easy. Although Rick's mother listened to the story mostly in silence, she did so with an increasingly incredulous expression. When they were done, she blurted, "Do you honestly expect me to believe all of this?" "But it's true, Mum," said Rick. "I swear." "Nonsense," snapped Amanda. "I don't know why this woman has been filling your head with such garbage, but I don't—" And then a quiet voice from the doorway said, "It is true, Mum. Every word." They all turned. Chris was standing there, hollow-eyed and haunted. He came into the room. "I've seen one of them," he said. "One of the aliens?" He nodded at Martha. "I talked to your friend the doctor about it." "You've seen—" Amanda said faintly. She slumped back against the kitchen counter, as if the strength had gone out of her legs. "Where was this?" "Right out there," said Chris, pointing at the kitchen window. "Over by the tree." Rick looked at his brother with something like awe. "What did it look like?" he asked. "Like something out of a nightmare," said Chris. 10 feet tall, thin, with a great big head and fingers as long as your arm." He shuddered. "I don't ever want to see one again." "Now do you believe us, Mrs. Pirelli?" asked Martha. Rick's mother looked uncertain. Her hands were shaking. "I don't know," she said. "I mean, how can I? It's crazy." "What do you think's causing this mist?" said Rick. "And that earth tremor earlier?" said Chris. "That was the tree. I know it was." Martha was nodding. "It was the doctor. He did that. Gave it a drop of his blood. It couldn't handle it." "Alien blood," said Rick. "I need to sit down," said Amanda. Chris fetched his mother a chair and she plumped into it gratefully. "So, this book," she ventured. "It's called the necklace," said Martha. "It's vital to them. It's my job to keep it safe." "Our job," Rick corrected her. "Safe from what?" Amanda asked. "The Havoken. Well, they're agents. The doctor said they'd send agents to retrieve it." "And these agents would be—" "Anything," said Rick. "The Havoken can make things come alive." At that precise moment they heard a fluttering sound from the hallway outside the kitchen, and then something thumped against the door. The first thump was followed by several others in quick succession. Whatever the objects were, they were small but compact, and they had a bit of weight to them. Martha's initial thought was that the door was being pelted with tennis balls, or at least something of a similar size and shape. She looked at Rick. Having barely recovered from their pursuit by the clown, he was now wide-eyed and pale all over again. Amanda rose slowly to her feet. "What is that?" she asked fearfully. "Trouble," said Martha. "How strong is that door?" "Pretty strong," said Chris. The rapid thumping abruptly ceased. There was a brief flurry of fluttering movement, like the sound of a bird trapped in a chimney. Moments later, this was followed by the tinkle of breaking glass, and then silence. Martha and the Pirellis crouched, tense, motionless, listening, for maybe half a minute. "Have they gone?" Rick whispered at last. "Maybe," Martha replied, thinking of the breaking glass, though she couldn't honestly believe that whatever had been on the other side of the door would have given up so easily. She was right. The words were barely out of her mouth when the kitchen window shattered. Amanda screamed and jumped up as broken glass fell into the sink and something black and fluttering entered the room. The black thing flew straight at Martha. She had a split second to register that it was a bat, sporting a gaping mouth of needle-sharp teeth, and then she was swinging the necklace. More by luck than judgment, she hit the bat full on. There was a green flash, enough to send a numbing jolt like an electric shock down both of her arms, and the bat flopped lifelessly to the ground. They all stared incredulously at it for a moment, and then in a high, chalky voice Amanda said, "It's made of rubber." She began to laugh hysterically, and then abruptly stopped. "Is it yours?" Martha asked Rick, clenching and unclenching her hands to try and get the feeling back into them. Rick nodded. "I decorated the TV room with them, 'cause that's where me and the guys were planning on hanging out later. I had a big bag of them. They were 50 for $5 at the Easy Mart." His voice tailed off as he realized what he was saying, and a look of horror crossed his face. Martha ran to the broken window and looked out. "Oh my," she whispered. Swirling 10 meters up in the air, like flecks of ash against the green mist, were the rest of the bats. Having abandoned their attack on the stout kitchen door, they had evidently exited the house to search for a more vulnerable point of entry. To Martha, they resembled a small but deadly tornado spinning in a fluttering, silent circle. Even as she watched, however, they reformed. They stopped their spinning and gathered together in a dense black mass. Then they began to stream downwards, like an unspooling ribbon, heading straight for the house. "They're coming!" she yelled, twisting away from the window. "Run!" Martha stopped just long enough to grab a frying pan off the stove, which she handed to Chris. They all pelted towards the kitchen door. Rick had his hand on the handle and was pulling the door open when the rest of the kitchen windows exploded inwards. A second later, bats were swooping and diving towards them. As Chris swatted them with the frying pan and Martha fended them off with the necklace, Rick yanked open the kitchen door and all but shoved his mother ahead of him through the gap. Martha felt the needle teeth of the bats scratching her hands and threw up her arms to stop them plunging their fangs into her face. Chris grabbed the collar of her leather jacket and yanked her backwards through the door. Martha had the presence of mind to grab the handle with her free hand and pull the door shut behind her. One bat, caught half in and half out of the closing door, was crushed into a mangled lump of rubber and fell to the floor, bloodless and inert. Around a dozen bats had made it out of the kitchen with them. Martha and Chris did their best to fight them off as they ran towards the stairs. Martha had no real idea where they were going. Outside was a no-no. They would be sitting targets in the open. Their best bet was to find a small space that couldn't be breached and lock themselves in. Preferably somewhere without windows. A wardrobe or a cupboard, say. They ran up the stairs and along the upper landing. Chris leaped and whacked a bat with the frying pan as it swooped towards Martha's face. He reminded her of a tennis player performing a winning smash. Then he was grabbing her jacket once again, pulling her into the bathroom. When they were inside, Rick slammed the bolt into place. The few bats still pursuing them thumped ineffectually against the door for the next 15 seconds or so, then stopped. Once again there was silence. With shaky hands, Chris put the frying pan carefully on the floor and wiped sweat from his forehead. Amanda pointed at Martha with a trembling finger. "You brought this on us," she said. "Mum," said Rick, appalled, but Amanda silenced him with a glare. "You've endangered my family," she said to Martha, her voice full of quiet range. "Why did you have to come here?" Martha looked shamefaced. "I'm sorry," she said. "You're right, and I'm sorry." "It's not your fault," said Rick vehemently. "Mum, I asked Martha to come." Martha held up the hand that was not holding the necklace. She looked oddly as though she was swearing an oath on the Bible. "No, Rick, your mum's right. I shouldn't have put you in danger. I should have handled this on my own." "Yeah, well, we're here now," said Chris. "So instead of arguing, let's decide what we're going to do." "I don't think there's much we can do except wait," said Martha. "Wait for what?" Amanda wanted to know. Martha looked at her. In truth, she was a bit stumped. What indeed? However, she said firmly, "The doctor." "Your friend?" said Amanda, unconvinced, and still somewhat hostile. "So he has all the answers, does he?" "Usually," said Martha. "Or if not, then he makes them up as he goes along. He's pretty good at that." "And what if he doesn't come back?" Amanda said. "He will," said Martha. "But what if he doesn't?" "Then we'll just have to manage, won't we?" Martha said, more sharply than she intended. "Shush," said Chris. His ear was pressed to the door. "I think I hear something." They all fell silent and listened. Faintly, but getting louder, they could hear an odd sound. It was a rhythmic series of dry, rattling clicks, like small pieces of wood or stone being wrapped together. "What is it?" whispered Rick. Martha licked her lips. She was thinking of a scene from a movie she had watched as a kid, where living skeletons had grown from the scattered teeth of a dead monster. "I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But it sounds to me like bones," she said. The rattle-click of movement came up the stairs, along the landing, and stopped outside the door. In some ways, the few seconds of silence that followed its arrival were even worse than the approaching sounds had been. Chris stepped back from the door, staring at it warily. Martha and Rick exchanged a glance. Amanda retreated to the back of the room, pressing her hands to her mouth as if to stifle a rising scream. Then there was a crash, and a hairline crack appeared in one of the door's upper wooden panels. Martha looked around desperately for something to defend herself with, but the best weapon available was the one she was already holding. She raised the necklace above her head, readying herself for action. Another crash, and the crack widened, slivers of wood falling inward. There wasn't much the four of them could do, except watch the thing smash its way through the door. With each blow, more of the panel splintered and collapsed. Finally, a sizable chunk of wood fell onto the bathroom floor. Immediately, a hand and part of an arm thrust its way through the jagged hole it had created. Just as Martha had feared, the hand was white, fleshless, skeletal. She shuddered at the brittle scraping the twig-like fingers made as they scuttled across the wood towards the bolt. Swallowing her revulsion, she stepped forward and brought the necklace down as if to squash a bug, hoping to disconnect the hand from its spindly wrist, perhaps even to pulverize it. The creature, however, seemed to anticipate her attack and snatched its hand back through the hole just in time. The momentum of Martha's swing made her stumble forward and drop onto one knee, her face within reach of the hole in the door. The living skeleton on the other side suddenly bent and lunged forward, filling the gap with its chalk-white face, its empty eye sockets level with Martha's eyes. The skull's lipless jaw creaked wide open and, though it had no vocal cords, the creature hissed at her. Its breath, how could it have breath? It had no lungs, smelled of grave mould and the dank, sulphurous odour of the Hevoken's lair. Martha recoiled, sprawling on her back on the bathroom floor, coughing and spluttering. Even as she was pushing herself back up to her sitting position, the creature was reaching through the hole in the door once again. "Stop it!" she yelled, but it was too late. The bony fingers wrapped themselves around the bolt and tugged it from its socket. A second later, the door swung open, and there stood the skeleton, bones clicking and creaking as it shifted its weight, horribly, impossibly alive. The necklace was lying on the floor, a few inches from Martha's hand. With frightening speed, the skeleton rushed forward, reaching down and grabbed it. "No!" Martha shouted, and made a snatch for it herself, but her fingers closed on empty air. As the skeleton straightened up with its prize, Martha was half aware of Chris stepping over her, his hands outstretched. She looked up and saw that he was holding a toilet roll in one hand, a cigarette lighter in the other. She saw him light the toilet roll and then thrust it between two of the skeleton's ribs, jamming it in place. The vertebrae in the skeleton's neck clicked as it tilted its skull to regard the burning wad of paper. Then, to Martha's astonishment, the creature burst into flames. It burned surprisingly quickly, fire racing along its network of bones, engulfing it within seconds. It opened its mouth in a soundless scream as it shriveled and blackened, collapsing in on itself. Its spine snapped, and its burning skull tumbled between its charred collarbones and into the crumbling ribcage. The necklace dropped from its lifeless hands and into Martha's arms. Rick and Chris ran forward with wet towels and doused the flames before they could spread and set fire to the house. They smothered the heap of bones and trampled them into burning ash. Seconds later, all that was left of the skeleton was black mush and a hazy pall of greenish smoke. Chris turned to face Martha as she rose to her feet. He had a smudge of soot on his nose and was looking pleased with himself. "I remembered the bats," he said. "Ah, good," replied Martha, who didn't have a clue what he was talking about. "I remembered they were made of rubber, even when they were alive," he said, "and it suddenly made me realize what the skeleton was made of." "Ah," she said. Now she understood. She looked at the wet towels and the black gunk dribbling out from underneath. "Paper?" she said. "Yeah, well, cardboard, though I'm not sure how something made of cardboard can smash its way through a door." "Hevoken magic," Martha said, then thought of how the doctor would frown if he heard her say that. "Science, I mean." "What I want to know, Christopher," Amanda said, stepping forward, "is why you had a cigarette lighter in your pocket." Suddenly, Chris looked like a little boy who had been caught raiding the cookie jar in the dead of night. He said. Etta was getting worried. The doctor should have returned by now. "If I'm not back by 3, he had told her earlier, it means, or probably means, though again it could just be that, in plain English, if you please, doctor," she had said imperiously. "Well, it almost certainly means that the Hevoken are not, what's the phrase, open to negotiation." "And what should I do then?" she asked. "Call the police?" "Nah, they'd be about as much use as a sherbet umbrella. Your best bet would be to pack up and get out of town as quickly as you can. No, hang on. First, cancel the Halloween carnival, initiate some sort of evacuation procedure, and then pack up and get out of town as quickly as you can. See ya." 3 o'clock, he had said. She looked at the big metal clock on her kitchen wall, which had been chopping off the seconds of her life for the past 25 years. It read 3:05, though even as she glanced at it, It clunked on another minute. How long should she wait? Perhaps the negotiations, as he had called them, were more involved than he had anticipated. "Come on, Doctor," she muttered, desperate to hear the sound of his footfalls on the basement steps, willing him to appear like a manic jack-in-the-box in her kitchen. She had no doubt he was the spaceman he had claimed himself to be. He was simultaneously the most unsettling and reassuring man she had ever met, a mesmerizing combination of boyish charm and ancient wisdom. 10 minutes later she stood up. "Right then," she said. She had come to a decision. It was the only possible decision she could come to. Etta didn't think she was a particularly brave soul, but neither was she the kind of person who would leave a friend in the lurch. She wouldn't flee, as the doctor had advised, and there wasn't time to fetch help, which meant there was only one course of action open to her. She would launch a rescue mission. She would get the doctor back, or die in the attempt. Arming herself with a torch, she descended the basement steps and lowered herself gingerly into the storage space beneath the floor. The metal door in the side wall was still ajar. She tugged it open and shone her torch into a cramped black tunnel. Rotting timbers, irregularly spaced, looked to be the only things preventing the tunnel from collapsing in on itself. Etta shuddered, took a deep breath, and thought briefly of how this would play havoc with her arthritis. Then she got down on her hands and knees and crawled inside. "Ow!" said the doctor. Every time he moved, even just a little bit, the vines securing him flashed green and gave him a zap of energy. It was like being continually jabbed with a cattle prod. "Can't you turn the juice down on this thing?" he called. "It tickles." The Hovoken ignored him. They had been ignoring him for the past 20 minutes. They were drifting about their central chamber, describing symbols in the air, occasionally chanting or muttering in their breathy, childlike voices. Their movements seemed arbitrary, but the doctor knew they were conjuring something, that their actions were far more purposeful than they appeared. He hoped Martha was safe. He had no choice but to entrust her with the necklace, but he still knew that if anything happened to her because of it, he'd never forgive himself. He had tried various methods to get the Hovoken to listen to him, but they were having none of it. Perhaps now was the time to take a gamble, therefore, to mix a few home truths in with a dose of good old-fashioned bluffing. "All right," he said, "cards on the table. Your lot don't exist anymore. Your people were banished to the deep darkness by the Eternals when your endless, stupid war with the Carrionites threatened to bring this universe and countless others crashing about your, well, I would say ears if you had any. Point is, you didn't know when to stop, did you? And so the Eternals kicked you out. The only reason they didn't find your little group was because you were already under the earth, dormant. You've been there for thousands of years, that tiny speck of consciousness that kept you alive, waiting and waiting for humankind to get clever enough to kickstart your resurrection. You've become legends on this planet, part of folklore. You've seeped into the nightmares of 1,000 generations of children." He took a deep breath. Here came the bluffing part. "But the irony is, if you get this creaky old ship of yours working again, it'll be like a beacon to the Eternals. They'll find you and they'll stamp you out. You're nothing but a stray bit of dirt to them. A lone germ, a last surviving cockroach. Is that what you really want? A final glorious ascent into the heavens and then splat. Bye-bye, Hovoken. 'Cause that's what'll happen unless you listen to me. I can take you somewhere in my TARDIS where the Eternals will leave you alone, where they'll let you live out your lives in peace. So come on, boys, what do you say? Do this thing my way, and everyone's a winner." Still they ignored him. And then they ignored him some more. The doctor sighed, scowled. "All right," he muttered. "Please yourselves." Even while he had been talking, his mind had been working constantly, furiously, trying to think of a way out. He knew there had to be one. There always was. It was just a case of working it out before it was too late. Something to his left caught his eye, a glimmer of light different to the swamp-like iridescence that pulsed and flickered and bubbled in the Havoken's lair. As surreptitiously as he could, the doctor glanced in that direction. He didn't know whether to feel heartened or dismayed to see Etta appear in the cavernous entrance to the central chamber. He was about to mouth at her to turn off her torch when she noticed the Havoken for the first time and dropped the torch out of sheer fright. It landed on the ground and broke. A black vine immediately snaked from the wall and snatched it up. Green sparks flew as the vine tightened on the torch, crunching it into mangled pieces of plastic and metal. A nearby Havoken, apparently alerted by the sound, drifted across. Etta could only stand there transfixed with shock as the alien loomed over her. The doctor clenched his teeth, waiting for the inevitable. But then, to his astonishment, the Havoken drifted away, as if the old lady wasn't worth its attention. Why had it simply ignored her? Was it something to do with her age? Her lack of physical threat? And then it came to him. "Psst," he said. Etta hadn't spotted him yet. She was too overawed by the crawling walls and the Havoken themselves. She turned her head and blinked in his direction. Backlit by pulsing green light, the walls writhing around her, she looked endearingly out of place. She dithered a moment, glanced at the Havoken again. The doctor flicked his head in a "come here" gesture, and received another painful zap for his troubles. Her eyes and mouth wide in terrified awe, moving almost as if she was shell-shocked, Etta plodded across to him. The Havoken paid her no attention whatsoever. The doctor almost laughed out loud. "As you can see, I got a bit tied up," he whispered. Etta stared at him. "Are those things really aliens? I feel as if I'm dreaming." "Yup, they're aliens," said the doctor casually, "and so am I. And so are you, come to that. We're all aliens together." "Why are they ignoring me?" she asked. The doctor grinned. "They don't see you as human," he said. "You and your ancestors have absorbed so much Havoken energy over the past couple of 100 years that they see you as part of themselves, part of their ship. I reckon when they turned the cats on us yesterday, you could have just stood there and they'd have run straight past you." "Now he tells me," said Etta dryly, making the doctor grin again. "So what do I do to get you out of here?" "Well, if I'm right," said the doctor, "you should be able to make these things release me just by thinking about it. Put your hands on the vines, close your eyes, and command them to let go with your mind. Believe you can do it. Think like a Havoken." "All right, I'll give it a try," said Etta dubiously. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hands on a couple of the vines entwined around the doctor and squeezed her eyes closed. For a moment or more, she stood motionless, holding her breath, and then she blurted, "Nothing's happening." "Try harder," urged the doctor. "Imagine the vines loosening, going limp and floppy. You're the boss, Etta, not them. You're the one in control. Just be your natural, stroppy self and you'll be laughing." "Humph," she said, but she squeezed her eyes closed again and scrunched up her face, redoubling her efforts. The doctor cheered her on silently, and after a few seconds he felt the vines beginning to loosen. He pulled one arm free, then the other. Seconds later, the vines simply sagged from him, slumping to the floor and crawling sluggishly back to the wall like injured snakes. "Oh, top job, Mrs. Halligan," he whispered. "Now let's scarper before they notice." They began to hurry across the central chamber towards the door. They were halfway across when they heard what, in Havoken speak, amounted to cries of alarm. A mass of agitated, sibilant whispers. "Keep going," the doctor muttered to Etta, and turned round. The Havoken were flowing towards him, taloned hands outstretched. More vines were detaching themselves from the walls, snaking in his direction. The doctor whipped his sonic from his pocket, turned it on, and held the business end to his wrist. "Stop!" he shouted, and amazingly everything did. The Hovoken hovered in the air, facing him. The vines twitched and curled, but stayed where they were. "Either let me go, or I'll open this vein here and now," he said. "You might have worked out how to cope with a few drops of the hard stuff, but a whole armful of top-grade diesel in a lead-free engine? Very nasty. And don't think for a second that I won't sacrifice myself to cripple this ship and save the people up there, because I've already got far too many deaths on my conscience, and I'll do whatever it takes not to get any more." He glared at the Hovoken, relaying through his thought waves and his body language that he meant every word. From the corner of his eye, he saw Etta hurrying away. The Hovoken regarded him for several long seconds, drifting in the dank subterranean air like flotsam on the tide. Then their leader made a dismissive gesture. "Go." The doctor nodded slowly and backed away, Sonic still pressed to his wrist. "Wise decision," he said.